The Huffington Post is one of the most popular websites on the internet, receiving millions of views every month. It bills itself as the internet newspaper, and its CEO, Arianna Huffington, has declared that we are increasingly seen as an internet newspaper, not positioned ideologically in terms of how we cover the news. However, the Huffington Post has proven itself to have a clear bias on the subject of the Arab-Israel conflict. The Huffington Post treats Israeli and Palestinian victims of violence differently, as demonstrated in their choice of news stories to cover and in their choice of pictures. On May 15, 2011, Palestinian rioters attacked Israeli policemen, and here we see the picture used by the Huffington Post. What was not covered at all was the shooting death of a 24-year-old Israeli 2 weeks earlier. Let us go further back to the spring of 2011. Take a look at the picture the Huffington Post chose to use for the abduction of Dirar Abu Sisi from the Ukraine by Israel, the innocent little girl pining for her father. What you may not know is that Sisi has been indicted for being one of the primary rocket manufacturers for Hamas. Clearly, the Huffington Post chose to mine for sympathy instead of telling the whole story. Contrast this picture of Sisi's daughter with the Huffington Post's coverage of the Itamar massacre, in which 5 members of the Fogel family, including 3 children, were killed in cold blood. Quite the difference, don't you think? The pattern continues. Contrast the death of a Hamas militant in Gaza with the death of a foreign worker in Israel. Again, we are told that the death of one is more tragic than the death of the other. On March 24th, a bomb went off in Jerusalem, wounding dozens of people and killing Mary Gardner of Orkney, Scotland. The Huffington Post chose to use a generic picture of Jerusalem city streets to accompany that story. When Israeli settlers went on a rampage in the West Bank, we see distraught Palestinians standing amongst the remains of their damaged home. And yet when 3 unarmed Israelis, including a pregnant woman, were shot to death by Palestinians, what do we see? Not the victims, obviously. Our first question: why does the Huffington Post treat Israeli victims of violence and Palestinian victims of violence so radically differently? Why are Palestinian victims humanized in the photographs while Israeli victims are ignored or marginalized? In this same time period, 2 activists were killed by unknown militants in the Palestinian territories. One, Vittorio Arrigoni, was an Italian who actively supported violence against Israel. Giuliano Mayorkamis was another pro-Palestinian activist who was killed by militants. And in an article about the Rachel Corrie trial, we see a picture of her grieving parents. Let's not forget Furkan Dogan either. Are you seeing a pattern here? Well, it's about to break. On December 19, 2010, an American tourist named Christine Lucan was stabbed to death by 2 Arab men. Here is the picture the Huffington Post used. Our second question: why did Arrigoni, Mayorkamis, Dogan, and Corrie all receive pictures in the Huffington Post illustrating stories about them, while Lucan and Gardner did not? May we conclude that if a foreigner in Israel is killed by violence and is not a pro-Palestinian activist, that the Huffington Post will ignore or marginalize the story? We must therefore conclude that in coverage of this issue, the Huffington Post is not dedicated to fairness or to balance. The evidence shows that Israeli victims of violence are treated differently than Palestinian or pro-Palestinian victims of violence. If you would like to know why, click on the Contact Us page at the Huffington Post. Let us know what they say.